Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first part of our two-part webinar series on engaging with cultural ecosystem services across the National Estuary and Research Reserve System. This first webinar is focused on celebrations, and we're excited to celebrate celebrations today. And before we do so, we welcome everyone to join us in the Mentimeter. There are a couple of questions that in a poll that we'd love for you to answer to get a sense of what everyone's thinking about as they come to this webinar today. All right, I'm gonna take us to see some of these webinar responses right here. So thanks to all who are joining us this morning. If you haven't already, you can join us on the Mentimeter. Information is just up above. So our first question was, why are you interested in cultural ecosystem services? Great answer is interested because you're interested in valuing ecosystem services, interested in understanding how to value as a resource. I want to better understand cultural connections and personal values. Perfect, you're in the right place. More intentional program, excellent. Looking for ways to engage residents to be more involved in the health of the ecosystem. Great, lots of different reasons to engage with cultural ecosystem services. CES are not traditionally evaluated as much as other ecosystem services, yet they capture all the ways in which we benefit from nature. Awesome. Our second question was, what words come to mind when you think about celebrations? Community is pretty big. Happiness, family, milestones, joy, heritage, gatherings, engaging, indigenous, culture, enjoyment, friendship. Awesome. Excellent. And then finally, why do we celebrate? We celebrate to pass on tradition, to lift each other up, or recognize special occasion or milestones, accomplishment. Celebrations are a great way to show support and interest, to connect to our community. We celebrate for conservation. Yes, sometimes we do. Celebrate for a sense of community, to mark occasions, to share our values and bond over them. Excellent. Celebrate to raise people up, to remember, to pass on information, to reaffirm culture and beliefs. Excellent. I'm excited. It sounds like we're all in the right energy and lots to learn and share today. So I welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us on our first of two webinars on engaging with cultural ecosystem services across the National Estuary and Research Reserve System. This first one is on celebrations. And I am Rachel Dax. I am from the Hawaii. I work at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, where the Heʻeia NERR is centered, the Office for the Heʻeia NERRS at HIMB. I do not work for the NERR. I work with Heʻeia NERR and other folks who are on this project. We'll be joined today from folks from 4 different reserves, and they'll introduce themselves as they come on. And they'll be sharing, together we'll be sharing about how we engage with cultural ecosystem services through celebrations. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Oh, I just wanted to mention also that there are a couple of folks from the Science Collaborative who are on the Zoom with us. So if there are any technical issues or anything you got questions or need assistance with, please chat us up in the chat, and someone will be able to help you. So thanks. All right, so I'm assuming if you're here with us this morning, you've heard about cultural ecosystem services, or you're interested in them, or you're engaging with them through different approaches already at your reserve. So excellent. But I just wanted to reaffirm and kind of ground us all in the same place that cultural ecosystem services are one of several ecosystem services that are used in ecosystem service assessments and evaluations. And CES, or Cultural Ecosystem Services, help us to articulate the many valuable ways that the environment contributes to our well-being, as somebody mentioned in the Mentimeter. In particular, cultural ecosystem services, maybe from experiences, they may be connections to people that are facilitated through places, connections to place themselves. Cultural ecosystem services may include sustenance, both kind of food sustenance and other ways that we're supported and fed by our environments. And some of this may sound familiar to many of you but you may not be using the language cultural ecosystem services. And so perhaps you're using kind of this concept, but calling it another name, and that's definitely a possibility. So there are other conceptual frameworks that also investigate how our landscapes, our seascapes, our estuaries, how they contribute to human well-being. And some of them, this is not a complete list, but some of these concepts or conceptual frameworks include human dimensions, nature's contributions to people, reciprocal relationships with nature, biocultural relationships, One Health. If you use another name, I'd love to hear it in the chat. I always like to have a running list of these things because not everyone uses the cultural ecosystem services framework. And we know in the last couple of years, one of those things on that list was human dimensions. And we know that there's been a push within the NERR system to focus more on human dimensions, and that's inclusive of cultural ecosystem services. And why would a reserve or why would somebody want to do this? Well, within the NERRS in particular, engaging with cultural ecosystem services can really help to inform future visioning and planning, to monitor efforts that are already happening, they're ongoing. Engaging with cultural ecosystem services can help us to evaluate the success of our activities, our programs, our projects. They can also help us to broadly understand the relationships that people have with estuaries. And then finally, like really broad, really kind of a first step in this process, approaches that help us to engage with cultural ecosystem services can help build or strengthen relationships with local communities. And I did want to mention that beyond the benefits, it's also really important to mention that if cultural ecosystem services or other human dimensions, if they're not considered in our efforts, there may be significant adverse impacts in terms of public support or opposition to our activities. And so to continue some of the work that we started in this cultural ecosystem service space, as we started some of this work in a Catalyst project, which a couple of folks on this call were also part of, to continue the work, and to scale up this work to other reserves, we are conducting a science transfer project titled Reciprocal Relationships in Reserves, establishing a community of practitioners for identifying and using cultural ecosystem services approaches. And our objectives for this project include transferring knowledge on cultural ecosystem service approaches through activities such as this webinar. We know that everyone's busy and it's hard to add more tasks to our large piles. But as such, and another objective of this project is really to make recommendations for operationalizing approaches that engage with cultural ecosystem services within existing NERR efforts. So in this webinar, you'll see us highlight celebrations that we already host or participate in as really potential opportunities for engaging engaging in some of these approaches or methods to understand cultural ecosystem services. And then finally, as we transfer our knowledge and experience, we're building this cohort to support each other through sharing our lessons learned and helping in planning future activities. And so we'll tell you at the end of this webinar today how you can join us if you wish, or stay engaged and be supported in your cultural ecosystem service efforts. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, one of the goals of this project is to really establish and train up a cohort that identifies and assesses cultural ecosystem services. So in the early stages of this project, in the early stages of organizing the cohort, I conducted interviews with interested individuals from the core team of 4 reserves and then 5 additional reserves to understand kind of where they are in their CES journey. And one of the findings was that interviewees or reserves lie along this spectrum of knowing about cultural ecosystem services or using approaches to engage with them. And I found that the individuals on the end of the spectrum with limited knowledge indicated that they wanted to learn more through concrete examples of how other reserves are engaging with CES. And that's partly what we're doing today. Another finding was that reserves with limited familiarity with CES, they are conducting activities or programs in which they do engage with CES, but they may not be using formal methods or approaches to actually identify or evaluate cultural ecosystem services during these activities. So as such, our project team is organizing, again, these 2 webinars with the goal of providing examples of how we are engaging with CES for other reserves to identify these opportunities, hopefully from activities that they're already conducting in which they can more formally use some approaches to understand cultural ecosystem services. And then finally on this slide, I also want to use kind of the spectrum figure to highlight that getting to the right end of the spectrum is a process, right? And it's a process that involves engaging with cultural ecosystem services in ways that may require building or maintaining, strengthening relationships. So those relationships are part of the steps of this process, beyond kind of learning methods and learning approaches to evaluate or identify cultural ecosystem services. The relationship building is really essential. And some of the methods that we've shared in past webinars and sessions, those methods can be used not only for the assessment or evaluation, right? But those methods really can be used a little bit more casually to build those relationships. And I think you'll hear a little bit more about that today. Okay, so then finally, why are we starting this webinar series with celebrations? So again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we're really trying to identify things that we're already doing that we can kind of just slot in some methods or approaches to identify CES. And so in speaking with the reserves who are interested in engaging with CES, many reserves mention that they interact with communities within or surrounding their NERR through celebrations that they either host or they participate in. So that's why we're starting with celebrations, and celebrations are so fun. I love to say that I'm hosting a webinar on celebrations as part of my job, which is not event planning, right? So celebrations are already occurring in many of our reserves. Oftentimes, these celebrations that do occur within our reserve, they're actually focused on celebrating cultural ecosystem services, either of a place or of a specific natural resource within our reserve. And as such, they're a great opportunity to identify, assess, or more deeply understand the cultural ecosystem services that people experience within our reserves. So that's all I've got up front for you all. I'm going to pass the mic to Chris Fort from Wells NERR, who's going to take us along this celebration journey. So thanks, Chris.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. Could you make this full screen?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Oops.
There we are. Okay, thank you. Well, everyone, I'm going to start out with kind of a broad picture because you might be thinking like I was thinking when we first talked about doing celebration as our first theme. And I thought, well, is it the Laud Home Crafts Festival? Is it Pumpkin Fiddle? And I thought I had to just center on one thing. But what I ended up seeing was like looking through a kaleidoscope. And the kind of kaleidoscope I mean is the kind you hold up to your eye and it looks at the outside world, but it breaks it into many different facets. So the more I thought about celebration, the more facets I saw at the Wells Reserve. And I decided to approach celebration at Wells as a participant observation process, where I would look at all the activities, practices, and events that we had during this summer and how they celebrate connections people have to the reserve. So put your kaleidoscope up to your eyes and think about your individual reserve with some examples here from Wells. Next slide. So when the Wells Reserve was first created, it was to preserve a treasured cultural landscape. Now, in this picture, you've got an image of the original log home farm, which was at that time, turn of the century, early 1900s, a state-of-the-art cattle operation, just as now, dairy operation, just as now it's a state-of-the-art research and education facility. And one of the celebrations we've had over the years to honor that cultural heritage was called Pumpkin Fiddle. And we combined it with Estuaries Day. So it was a combination harvest festival and celebrating Estuaries Day with events around the farming heritage, but linking it to the estuary. So initially I thought, well, I'll tell the story of that, but it expanded to much more than just the story of Pumpkin Fiddle. Next slide. So here's how I did participant observation, which is a social science technique I learned studying for my PhD dissertation. And it is looking at a situation that you're embedded in to learn something. So here were the 10 steps of my experiment to learn about the celebrations at the Wells Reserve. First, we selected the theme. And early on in this period in the summer, we were part of a pilot project with the Human Dimensions work group, where a survey of all the social science research that had been done at the reserve based on our management documents was put together by the Human Dimensions team. And then a team from the reserve went through that list. And that very thorough listing of everything that seemed to relate to social science kind of primed the pump for thinking about celebrations. Then another event we had, which you might not think was a celebration, but it turned out to be, in early June, the International Association for Society and Natural Resources had a conference in Portland, and a couple of us from the reserve system designed a field trip where that group would come to the reserve and look at our research stewardship and visitor activities. And we had people from all over the world. And what rose to the top, the thing that these international folks were most surprised by, was our volunteer program and the way people engaged in the reserve to do community science, to help us with our celebrations. And I learned a lot more about the role of volunteers in celebrating our natural resources. The other things I did, I had conversations with people at the reserve. I had a new technique, which I call window listening. My office is on the 3rd floor of the farmhouse. So all the activities going on outside at the reserve, from summer camps to families coming to participate in the reserve, to weddings and proms outside the window. So I named that particular method window listening because I just had to look out my window and see it. Another document I looked at the recent NOAA annual report, and I read the report from all the sectors for the past 6 months, looking for anything that was a celebration, and every single sector had examples of celebration. And then more detailed, we had a Davidson fellow who conducted her PhD research on place attachment and sense of place. And then the idea I started with, the craft festival and pumpkin fiddle. And then at the end of this observation, I kind of looked back at the literature and I developed a concept called the System-Wide Monitoring Program for Cultural Ecosystem Services. So next slide. So here's the kaleidoscope of activities at the Wells Reserve. That's our visitor center in the center. My office is up on the 3rd floor and the dormer on the far side where I did my observations. And just like your reserves, I'm sure food is involved constantly, and you're going to hear that from the other folks. And these are just some of the activities that came out in the kaleidoscope. And next slide. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was Jessica Buonicini's photo voice research. This summer, she gave a workshop teaching others about this social science technique. She interviewed and conducted her PhD research with residents of the 2 beaches near the reserve. This is an example of one of the pictures. All the people in the research use their cameras to take pictures to answer the question, when you think about this place, what makes it special? And this was one of the photos, and I'll let you read through that quote. It's pretty powerful. And she engaged about 20 people over a season, documenting what was special about the place. And she wasn't specifically asking them about climate change, but almost everyone who was documenting their sense of place spoke about change. And this became a research technique to look at one of the primary cultural ecosystem services. Okay, next slide. Another thing we have are art projects. In the upper right corner was a community art project that people engaged in, where every person came together and they were each given one little square to create. And then all the squares were put together to create the final picture of the great blue heron. The photograph is an art group working to draw landscapes. And this is one of several art projects that we have on the reserve to engage people in relating to nature through art and art therapy. Next slide. And then kind of a new program that's just getting started, something called the Portal Awareness Walks. This portal, which is huge, you could walk through this hole. It's on the reserve, it's a sculpture. And we have a therapist who is doing nature walks involving compassion, awareness of nature, and even some walks are focusing on dealing with grief. And this is looking at human well-being from a mental perspective on the reserve with nature as a backdrop. Next slide. And then this is the original and first previewed to this webinar, Swamp for Cultural Ecosystem Services. So it's looking at, and it's using a document that was created in the first Ecosystem Services project, Common Cultural Landscape, Cultural Ecosystem Services Frameworks. And there are 19 frameworks that were pulled together for that first project. And what I did, I looked at everything I observed and I put them into the categories from that framework. Now, the group working on this project knows I was a little bit disconcerted because there were 19 frameworks and I wanted there to be 20 frameworks for thinking about cultural ecosystem services. So I'm proposing adding the sense of wonder as a framework for number 20. And thinking about how we, in the reserve system, could think about monitoring these concepts in the same way that we do pH, dissolved oxygen, and other things to take the health of the estuaries. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sabrina Benz from Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Alaska.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I'm really excited to share with you today. I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator here in Alaska, Kachemak Bay, NERR, and I'm here to share 3 stories of celebration on behalf of my staff at the Reserve, who have been examining CES applications through both a Catalyst project and exchange with the Heʻeia NERR, and this current project in the cohort development. So these examples of celebrations focus on a significant place, event, and a species, and I hope to reveal some of the CES frameworks and relationships illustrated in celebrations and communicate some of the benefits to different NERRS sectors to engaging, identifying, and monitoring CES through celebration. Go ahead, Rachel. The first celebration focuses on a place, the Nilchik River and watershed. So this celebration of place was unique in that it started at the beginning of a project with the community and celebrate a beginning of a relationship with a celebration of collaboration rather than at the end of a project when we're kind of doing the final hurrah. So really interesting to think about funding mechanisms and making sure that we are honoring developing relationships and putting in the time for that at the beginning. This event was planned and led by an Inilchik tribe cultural partner, and it was a community-based celebration with local food and art and science expressions of the watershed, and included a floating art ceremony. Some of the CES frameworks to link to in this type of event were ceremony, cultural heritage, subsistence, and stewardship. The celebration was called Janen, and this was really meaningful because it can engage a new community or a new partner using language in a setting that promote dual fluency across knowledge systems. And the Janen celebration developed that shared sense of place related to watershed stewardship. For the reserve, for their stewardship sector, I wanted to share that celebrating a place that we all live and work helps bring people closer to understanding each other, how we are connected, and the ways that we live with and in the world. Working with cultural leaders has shown new ways to align the reserve conservation strategies with generations of stewardship and Indigenous knowledge. The second event that I'm going to share is a bird migration. So many reserves around the country, their wetlands provide an area as a stopover place for significant birds. The Kachemak Bay Shorebird Festival is an annual bird migration festival. It's Alaska's largest wildlife viewing event, and it's designed with an array of different events to celebrate the spring migration of Alaska's shorebirds. Each year, a different bird is chosen to celebrate, and art is commissioned for the festival materials. You can see on the program there on the right, the Kitlitz's Murrelet was selected in 2023. So a great way to really highlight a specific bird that people care about in our area. This event is planned and led by a coalition of organizations, and it attracts locals and visitors from around the world in shared appreciation. Different relationships to highlight here are those of the birders, with scientists, with artists, and with youth and families. Celebration like the Kachemak Bay Shorebird Festival, especially recurring celebrations, can be an opportunity to monitor both the environment and the cultural ecosystem services using a variety of methods like art, discussions, maps, surveys, and even things like eBird. So a research perspective on the benefit of celebrations is that celebrations gather people together and create a unique setting for supporting community science and data collection. In Homer, these data have contributed to over 20 years of citizen science, leading shorebird migration data, which continue to inspire new community-based research questions. So this is actually a great way to inform research priorities at the reserves. Some of the CES frameworks to highlight at the Shorebird Festival are ecotourism, aesthetics, inspiration, developing social relations, and intergenerational education. One of the biggest things that our education coordinator highlighted from this festival is there is a lot of family participation. And her perspective to share was that over the years, the Junior Birder program at the festival has inspired hundreds of youth and their families to get outside and learn the basics of birding. This opens the door to an intergenerational learning opportunity, creating a relationship to place for youth, teens, and adults, and an appreciation of the estuary for generations to come. Finally, I'd like to share the strong connection to a specific species we celebrate in Alaska, and of course, it had to be salmon. There are many celebrations of salmon in our region, including community watershed festivals, youth salmon celebrations, music festivals, and others. These celebrations unite diverse people around a shared appreciation of a common theme of salmon, but with potentially different relationships or values. Some CES frameworks present in these celebrations include material and subsistence use, like salmon for eating or salmon skin for making clothing or wallets, as is showed in the upper right corner there. It also contributes to our livelihoods, our economies, our identity, our inspiration, and bequest to future generations, and a sense of place and belonging. So celebrating salmon as a species connects us to the whole ecosystem, since they are anadromous and they're basically our headwaters all the way out into our nearshore and our oceans and our estuarine systems. Often, decision-making conversations around salmon as a resource and salmon habitat protection are focused on economic or provisioning benefits of salmon, but these types of celebrations and festivals have a presence of multiple organizations. And I think it's really important to elevate or make visible the variety of roles in conservation of this species that reveal some of the other relationships had with salmon that support our quality of life beyond the monetary value. A coastal training program perspective about helping identify and elevate those different values and CES frameworks is that Kachemak Bay Reserve does not directly manage any resources or lands, but we are able to fill gaps in knowledge and connect management entities with community priorities. Celebrations help develop language of what people value about salmon and elevate CES and different knowledge systems as an important component of management. With that, I think speaking next are our friends in Hawaii who have been a great inspiration for me in connecting research to people in their communities.
Thanks, Sabrina. So just to kind of set the stage for our portion from the Heʻeia National Estuarine Research Reserve, we'll dive into kind of like this larger ʻOhana Day event where we engaged and identified CES, but we're also going to touch on some smaller celebrations across our reserve and across our CTP research and education sectors. So just to give some context and background, Mokuʻalohi has a long, complicated history of private ownership. So the community have not always felt welcomed. And this event was really to promote connections between the Heʻeia community and the research community at Mokuʻalohi, as well as encourage access to this place. We leveraged funding using a Catalyst grant and collaborated with the Ahupua'a Accelerator Initiative and HIMB or the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology to host this effort. And to honor Heʻeia stewardship practitioners, their ʻOhana, and the place of Heʻeia, the event consisted of activities listed here, such as mural painting, mele or storytelling and song, and a huaka'i, or kind of a trip on a boat just to see different parts of the ahupua'a as well. Next slide. So this was really a celebration of people and place. We invited our co-management partners, many if not all of which are Heʻeia stewardship practitioners in one way or another. And this also included kupuna or elders who have been really active in supporting biocultural restoration and indigenous resource management long before the NERR was even established. And really importantly, we invited all their families. We wanted it to be a really fun time for all of those who participated. And we really kind of made sure to invite a smaller group of researchers because we wanted the group to be very balanced between all the different types of participants so as not to kind of overwhelm community with a large research presence. Next slide. So this event really celebrated CES from the place and the CES that came about from these celebrations. So activities included, if you look at the top left picture, that is actually a mural that was created on that day where we had people just kind of contribute to this piece of art. They really built pilina that way, or pilina also known as like relationships and connections. And it was an activity that keiki or children to kupuna elders could really participate in. But it also created something that is still present on Mokuʻalohi to this day. So you're building that pilina to place, and it was really representative of what Heʻeia is to them as well. If you look at the top right picture, we had a local halau perform a hula, which actually honored a lot of the wahipana, or these like very storied, legendary places of significance to people. And that hula celebrated all those places for the power and the respect and the honor that they deserve to have. We also, on the bottom left, did kind of a boat trip out onto the bay. And this really honored the ahupua'a and places within that. So right now we have a group of people, or not right now, sorry. In that picture, we have a group of people on Ahualaka, which is a very, very honored place to the people of Kaneohe Bay. And it just really connected people with nature. The bottom right, we have a picture of food. Food should really be the number one thing since we really like to incorporate food into every celebration that we have. But we had food from Heʻeia. So we had a lot of food that was brought in from a local kind of restaurant, but we also had food that was grown in Heʻeia as well and was produced by some of our co-management partners. And then in the middle bottom picture, we have lei making, which is a very celebratory practice that we really use to honor guests and people who enter spaces. And I will hand it over to Shimi.
Thanks, Casey. So we also wanted to provide a research perspective. So Casey, she's our coastal training program coordinator. I'm the research coordinator. And we work very closely together on a number of events that may or may not be large events. So ʻOhana itself was a very, it took a lot of planning, and it required, you know, a lot of partners, and it was truly a big celebration. But for the purpose of this webinar, we kind of did what Chris Fort did, where we examined what sort of celebrations we actually do on a regular basis, and we highlight some of them here. So what we're calling quote unquote small celebrations, meaning that they didn't require that as much planning as the ʻOhana, but of course they are you know, in general big celebrations to the people participating in it. So this top picture on the middle, they're actually all of us centered around pieces of wood that we actually shaved down to build a makaha, or a sluice gate for the Heʻeia fish pond. And that was actually a volunteer stewardship activity that we all volunteered. So pictured here is me and Casey and several of the NERR lab members, including an undergrad intern and our technicians and our new postdoc, and Fred here in the yellow is our education coordinator. And, you know, we all got together to do some stewardship, as well as we paired it with watching a presentation about groundwater through a USGS like a colleague from USGS. So we were actually joking around that was the most NERR thing to do, because we were doing a very cultural activity, but we were also watching a USGS groundwater talk at the same time. And then, of course, anytime we do a thesis defense or a community share out of some sort, we require all of our students to do co-development with our community. And then whenever they are able to have some data to share out, they meet with the community. And those are small meetings that can happen on a very casual basis. We have these community work days that we call Laulima, many hands, and many of our students actually go to these community work days, and then afterwards meet with our communities who are already there. And while they're eating lunch, you know, typically home lunch, you know, they'll talk very casually in an informal setting about some of the work that they're doing. And we still consider that a celebration, because like Chris Fort mentioned, it's a milestone of the student as well as the community member that is involved in that research. And then, of course, whenever there is a thesis defense, there's a big, you know, food and celebration, and we consider that celebrations where students hit that milestone and are able to celebrate their reaching this, you know, answer, or reaching this kind of like scientific and the community milestone of like getting at the answer that they wanted to for their research. And then you can also see the picture on the bottom right, are some kids looking at microscopes, and that was an example of Heʻeia Science Night. So we help host these events called Akeakamai Science Night at Heʻeia Fish Pond, and that's a very public event where Heʻeia Fish Pond invites some of their neighbors and people that they work with, the community members, and a lot of children come out, and a lot of neighbors, you know, and in this work, we highlight students and colleagues that actually share out some of the science that they do. And it's truly, you know, a celebration. It's a potluck event. And this most recent one that we did, we actually made it a very interactive one where they explored different stations of science by walking out onto the different walls of the makaha and experience, and having our grad students talk about some of the research that they do. And then, of course, the top right picture is actually Fred, our education coordinator, at the end of his Teachers on the Estuary teacher professional development event. And that ended in a big ho'ike, or a celebration and share out of the curriculum that the teachers in the region developed. And then another example is a kickoff meeting. So like Serena was mentioning not all celebrations need to happen at the end, but we typically start our meetings or grants with an advisory meeting, and that picture on the left bottom is actually a kickoff grant meeting for a science collaborative grant, the Y grant. And that was, we had some food and we all got together, and it was actually a celebration because it took us a long time to actually co-develop the research. And then here we were celebrating the fact that we were starting on this journey together and talking about the sites that we want to delve into and building on past knowledge. So there's knowledge transfer and generational knowledge as well. Next slide. Okay, so final slide is that applying CES as celebrations in Heʻeia, we did some reflection, and we think it's really about building pilina. That's a Hawaiian word for relationships and connections to people and place, and building this social cohesion so that you're not just one person or small groups of people doing different things within an area, but also coming together and doing something as a big goal. Like you guys, the audience member posted in the Mentimeter, it's really promoting this happiness and joy through lots of times food and just being together, and not necessarily talking about the subject at hand, but just really getting to know each other and the place. This knowledge transfer within these celebrations is really, really big component, multiple ways of learning in an informal way. And we also decided, or took away that there are some key points that we try to make happen within celebrations in Heʻeia, which is holding celebrations at a place that promotes connections with community. So many times we don't try to hold it in a closed room at a university or something. We try to hold it outside or a place that's meaningful. Ensuring that the people who are involved are invited to the event, not just like the researchers or not just the community members, but actually blending them together, and that the event planning facilitates participation. So, making sure that the time frame is conducive to people's work schedules, or for someone with kids. Celebrations do not always have to happen at the end of an event, but can happen in beginning or during shareouts, as many of the panelists already shared. And then recognizing that existing efforts and even smaller scale events as opportunities for promoting CES frameworks. So next, I'm going to pass it on to Kristen Goodrich and Megan Spitzer at the Tijuana River Estuary.
Thanks, Shami. Thanks, everyone. It's so nice to see you. This is really exciting for us to be able to get to share a little bit about the work we're doing at the Tijuana River National Estuarine Research Reserve. I'm Kristen Goodrich, the Coastal Training Program Coordinator, and I'm joined by Megan Spitzer, who is our California Sea Grant Fellow for the year, who is working on this project, as well as another NERRS Science Collaborative project, the NERRS Niche project that is looking at ways in which we can develop a roadmap for addressing marine debris within the research reserve system. So thanks for joining us, Megan. I'm also presenting on behalf of our Residuos team, which is an amazing group of folks who are essentially implementing a grant that we received. Next slide, please. Through NOAA's Marine Debris Program and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, which has allowed us to actualize a long-held dream of really coming together across borders to address the issues of solid waste management and marine debris in a very intentional way. And I put here some of our project components. So the Marine Debris Leadership Academy is just one of those components, but you can see here we have others. We're thinking about addressing circular economy issues and generating income in communities by upcycling waste. We're developing a binational emergency response guide. We're characterizing waste that has been intercepted by sedimentation basins and trash booms, and trying to better understand what debris actually looks and feels like in the reserve. And also addressing a number of other issues through community engagement and events, including the Tijuana River Action Month. But for today, I'm going to focus on the Marine Debris Leadership Academy, which we have been basically, now we're in week 7 coming up this week. It's an 8-week program that we have put on to basically convene leaders in the region. And bonus points for anyone who can see our little sub logo here. The MDLA logo is really representative of, in this picture, a leader, a community leader, and an environmental professional who has been working in the border region tirelessly for about 30 years. We recognize that those individuals who are engaging in this work and engaging across border are at times exhausted, at times looking for ways to maintain stamina, to address some of these really challenging issues. Marine debris for the Tijuana estuary is a significant ecological issue, but it's also an issue that affects human health, human well-being, and at times human security, because debris can cause catastrophic flooding in some of the canyon communities that we work within. So the intent behind the MDLA was really to think about what are the dimensions of adaptive leadership and how can we support these leaders in the region? We're doing that through spanning boundaries, both physical, the physical border infrastructure, but also boundaries that are cross-discipline or even psychological at times, expanding ways of knowing beyond just the academic and institutionalized ways of knowing, but honoring practical, generalized, foundational, and even artistic. And we'll share a little bit about that in a few minutes. And then finally, and I think this has just been so present in each of the presentations, this idea of developing and deepening relationships. And in our case, in our watershed, 3/4 of which is in Mexico, we really feel that it's important to cultivate relationships, think about social capital, and think about ways that we can really emphasize reciprocal relationships in this work. Next slide, please. So we're doing that through field experiences, we're doing that through experiential learning, we're doing that through training, through the Coastal Training Program by partnering with organizations who are offering training in cross-cultural communication, but also conflict transformation. And finally, through this binational relationship building. And you can see in the picture on the top left, one of our interpretation booths. So all of our events are simultaneously interpreted so that all participants can really benefit from what we're trying to provide through the MDLA. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot. We're so excited about the interest and just the diversity of organizations that are involved in the Marine Debris Leadership Academy, all scales of government in the US and Mexico, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, academia, even community members. They're all participating across these 8 weeks. And next slide, please. We're a unique presentation in this group because we are getting ready to celebrate the closing of the 8 weeks, the closing of the Marine Debris Leadership Academy. And as Sabrina has taught me through this community of practice, celebration can happen at multiple points during the process. So we're really lucky that we're gearing up for our celebration as we're learning from the rest of our colleagues in this group. So this is what I wanted to highlight that we were really surprised by. I think this is a picture of Holly. She is a science communicator who I had worked with previously through the Coastal Training Program, who did, maybe you could call it a pivot in her career, and started a project called the Breathline Project. And she's creating these ceramic cores, 2,030 of them, and she's personalizing them with stories and representations of scientists working on the forefront of ocean, earth, and atmospheric science. So I reached out to her, next slide, please, to really kind of think through what we could do for the marine debris leaders. Was there anything that she could imagine with us as a way to celebrate in a way, the beginning, the kickoff of the MDLA, our first week? And so she arrived at the reserve with in her mobile ceramic studio, which is a really amazing thing to see, and worked with the participants to develop these tiles, these ceramic tiles that kind of depicted ideas and concepts and feelings around the work that they're doing in the marine debris space. So you can see here one participant is, it looks like she spelled out team. And so next slide, please. it was a really joyful activity. And Chris, I took a note when you said this idea of window listening. I was kind of actually behind a window, kind of watching the participants interact with each other in this incredible way. We weren't sure how it would land because we had this mix, this diversity of participants, including some high-level officials in the Tijuana government. But folks were so gracious with each other. They were so excited. You can just pick up in this one picture, at least for us and our team, this just moment of pure joy with one of our actual project partners, Christy with NOAA's Marine Debris Program. But people got really engaged and creative, and it was a moment to kind of reflect on the work that they've done, reflect on what's ahead, and reflect on the kind of essence that they wanted to bring into the MDLA moving forward. Next slide, please. So again, we're in week 7 this week, and next week will be our final week. But just some of the outcomes emerging from the MDLA and some of this work together, including the more creative and artistic elements, is that we've been noticing as I described some of our ideas around the dimensions of what adaptive leadership means. Those definitions are changing and evolving, and I think that it's coming from the participants. This is a photo after a leadership circle that we came together around to have some difficult conversations around some really difficult topics, and we're able to apply even some of the lessons we're learning from the trainings in conflict transformation. But I think some of the other outcomes are increased vulnerability with each other, increased honesty, and then even increased dialogue through some of these really challenging social ecological issues. Maybe this is conflict transformation, but we're still in the process, so learning as we go. Next slide, please. So finally, next week we'll be arriving at week 8. This will be the Marine Debris Leadership Academy ceremony and celebration. I should say that across each of our 8 weeks, we have very intentionally held the sessions cross-border, so they've taken place both at the reserve, but within the watershed, which again, 3/4 of which is in Mexico. So our final week, very intentionally so, we are closing in Tecate at Rancho La Puerta, which is a pretty extraordinary retreat center, and will be an opportunity for folks to kind of engage with nature, engage with each other, and I think, as I've been listening to other presentations, really do so in an informal way. This is one of the least structured days that we have thought through, although we think that with the relationships that have been building across these 8 weeks, it will be very, very full of laughter and joy and just appreciation for each other. So the last slide. We are also in our celebration. Holly will be joining us again and riding a bus with us to Tecate, where she will be presenting each of the leaders with their tiles that they created on week 1. I think they are in the kiln as we speak, and will be presented as kind of a way to acknowledge just the extraordinary leadership of this group, and serve as a reflection of what's happened across these 8 weeks, but also what's to come. So we're really excited about that element of the celebration next week, and have learned a lot through this community of practice, and we'll be applying some of these things, I think, to next week as well. So thanks all for the opportunity to present on our week to come. Thanks.
Thank you all. That was an amazing recap of so many celebrations. And yeah, I think, Kristen, you ended us well in this forthcoming celebration, and just how some of our other lessons can be incorporated. So at this point, what we're going to do next is kind of open up this webinar to all of our panelists in a round robin. I have a few questions, including some from our audience members. So I just wanted to read this first question. What I struggle with is a disconnection from the land in the California Central Valley. It seems like nature is far away. We are surrounded by agriculture. I struggle to feel connected here, especially when I did not grow up here and prefer the Pacific Northwest, which is still home. I think this webinar helps validate my sense of not being home. It is a real thing to feel drawn to a certain area and the need to be there to feel right and whole. I also felt connected to Lake Tahoe, and it broke my heart to have to move away from that area. I encourage others to find their home and not fight these feelings of affinity for certain places. Thanks very much for sharing that. And I think some of the celebrations and activities in the celebrations that we mentioned really is linked to this home and those feeling, the sense of place and sense of connection that people have to places, and how those change over time, really, right? And how through celebrations sometimes those sense of place sentiments grow and can be developed. So thank you, Hannah, for that comment. I have a question for our panelists coming next, and it's very related to this, the second question that we got. So the second question was in speaking specifically, asking if there was anyone who could speak to approaches to monitoring and evaluating cultural ecosystem services over time for different groups or other challenges and or successful models, approaches you have found, given the complexity of monitoring, evaluating, and a diversity of well-beings for different groups in different locations, contexts. Excellent question, loaded question, lots there. And I just want to mention at this point that panelists feel free to share in this question, but I do want to mention that I'll give more details as we end this webinar, but tomorrow, same time, we're going to have a brainstorming session. So many of our core group members on this who are presenting today will join us, as well as anyone else who is interested in a very kind of informal setting where if you have an upcoming event or a celebration that you want to chat through, or you're in the middle of developing or designing an assessment or survey or other type of assessment for cultural ecosystem services, please join us. And it's very kind of like an office hours style where we can talk through that more. So that being said, panelists, I'm gonna give you this question, which you can all see, I think, in the Q&A. But alongside this question, I'd love to hear thoughts on kind of what are the next steps in your celebrations, right? So I think a lot of the activities that you mentioned in your celebrations are really kind of on the end of building relationships and perhaps identifying the cultural ecosystem services. But kind of what's the next step for next year's celebrations or upcoming celebrations now that you have potentially identified some of those cultural ecosystem services in your reserves? And I'm just going to throw it out. Whoever wants to come on, feel free to come on and chat. Okay, Shimi, take it.
Yeah, Rachel, hopefully I can answer the second question as well. So Rachel and Casey and I and several other people in our reserve, we've been talking about this like next step of, trying to get at monitoring CES for different groups. I think that really is the next step for us to evaluate them so that we can actually use them, to have, great graphics or, not just like right now, I think we're at a stage of like having quotes and, people's testimonials and things like that, and great pictures to show, that we've done today, but really being able to have some sort of graphical representation or something like that so we can use them in science collaborative grants or other granting agencies or anything like that. So, we have talked about actually formulating survey questions or some sort of other CES methods like art or some sort of thing with these different groups. One of the groups we're really interested in doing that with is our graduate assistants. We have many GAs from different departments, and we get them together for these like volunteer groups all the time. And we do an entry survey and a post-exit survey where we have some of these answers, but we haven't really examined them. So I think those are some of the challenges. And, we do them for teachers, we do them for visiting researchers, interns, but really trying to think of a consolidated method. And that's something I think will really benefit from bringing it out to the reserve system and seeing how other people are doing.
Thanks. I agree 100% with what she just said. And And thank you for the question and the Q&A, because I think that is really the next step for a lot of us. So in our experience over the last few years, I think that using some of these approaches has really created this community engagement and language, shared language that we can start to use. And we're building these reciprocal relationships, both among people and relationships to place, as we start to identify and elevate some of the frameworks that are present in our reserves and communities. I think the next step for me especially is thinking about how to most appropriately assess and monitor for CES, for use in like long-term monitoring and connection to decision making. And I think that a lot of that can be driven through conversations with community. Like what are your project partners? What methods are meaningful? Like what does success look like? And what kind of questions do you want to explore together? Or what kind of stories do you want to tell together? I think we're on the cusp of this really exciting time in creativity, especially for the coastal training programs at reserves, because we just voted as a sector to expand our thinking on how to evaluate our programs beyond like a 3-question survey that we typically use for our formal trainings. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to use some of these CES approaches and thinking creatively about evaluating future celebrations, future trainings, future education events that will really get to that meaningful data that can inform our programs and connect with driving research questions and connecting with management and co-management.
Kristen, please join.
Thanks, Rachel. I just feel like it's a good transition from what Sabrina just shared, because we I guess this would be our first experiment with doing a different kind of evaluation than we typically have done in the past. And that was at the very beginning of the MDLA, and we'll be doing it again at the end to do things like Coastal Training Program has typically done, measure increase in knowledge or intent to apply. But we went beyond that to really try to understand more qualitatively what some of the experiences are of these individuals, these professionals that are part of the participant group of the MDLA, and really understand what some of their struggles are. And I think we surprised some of the participants in our initial pre-MDLA survey by asking questions around burnout, because this is an issue that we have been studying and characterizing, and is particularly prevalent among this group of professionals who've been doing the work for most of their careers in a very capacity and limited context. And so just kind of wanted to touch on that, Sabrina, because I think there's some really exciting possibilities for ways in which we can think about measuring CES and other dimensions of, in this case, what leadership means to the group. Another thing I'll add too is just we've built or baked in training as part of the MDLA, and our trainers are asking questions among the participants about their experience with the training. And another way we surprised the participants, I guess, in this case, was that during week 1, I think they were expecting to get training on marine debris. I mean, it's a Marine Debris Leadership Academy, but we actually offered training at the very start on cross-cultural communication and conflict management and conflict transformation. And so folks were really like kind of surprised at first about that, but it ended up evolving over time that these were actual training skills and capacities that they could apply later on in the process when things became kind of tough. And so I don't know, I think these are just some interesting ways to like think about elements of surprise as for one, but also to think about just unique ways to measure what people are learning and what they're gaining out of experiences together. I don't know, Megan, did I capture some of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, I think that captures it perfectly. And to add anything, I think there's a really interesting element kind of relating to the initial mentee questions about why we have celebrations and what we think about with celebrations, especially in our context that we're having this really 8-week condensed, but also spread out training, but also just space for leadership and relationship building, is we're already starting to discuss and hear kind of from participant of like what's next. We're in this, it's not a vacuum as we're seeing with just events that are happening in this region, but it kind of feels like one sometimes. We're in this space together as a cohort. And when we leave this cohort, what's next? And how can we maintain this relationship, maintain this capacity of just engagement with each other, especially when we're talking cross-border and we're cross-language and cross-sectors. So I think that's really interesting things that we're starting to discuss, but also as like we talk about with estuaries, it's not specific to us as a NERR. It's also about the community and what the community needs of it. So making sure that whatever post community and post communications or activities we develop, it works for everyone in the capacities that make sense for them, and also still feels efficient and effective and just happy with how we are like treating our environment and treating our cross-border community.
Oh, and Chris, go for it.
Yes, and as far as kind of the future, just a minute, let me lower my hand. Okay. I've been so inspired by working with this group just on celebrations that we were having a meeting about a project we've been working on for 2 years that was pretty much kind of classic climate adaptation thinking. We engaged the 19 communities along the coast of southern Maine, and we were developing a regional resilience plan. And we did all the standard climate adaptation science. We did a vulnerability assessment. Then we identified all the places that basically are going to be underwater in the next 50 years. We mapped it. We engaged with people in prioritizing 52 locations that are extremely vulnerable on the coast of Maine, and talking about how would we prioritize those to develop a regional resilience plan to work together on. So we were having a planning meeting about our final workshop. And we were kind of getting down in the weeds about how depressing all this is. We look at these maps, we look at these places that are going to be underwater. Everyone is so overworked, like Kristen said, with burnout. And all of a sudden, the inspiration from this group popped into my head. And I said, I think the last workshop should be a celebration of hope. And first, everybody's reaction was, what? And then I said, but look at what we've done. Look at how far we've come. Indeed, it is bad news, but this group has engaged on working on this and making progress, not just in this project, but every community is working full out on building resilience. And I think we should honor that. And I think, like Rachel said earlier, the energy in the room changed. We haven't figured out exactly what we're going to do. It's going to be in October, but I've learned so much from my colleagues here that I think our group can work toward changing the energy of the next step, because the resilience plan was just a step in the process of then implementing that plan and working together for the future. So I've been really inspired, and I hope as many of you as can will join us tomorrow for our brainstorming session so we can hear your ideas as well.
Chris, that's a perfect segue into my final question for the group. And so Chris mentioned that tomorrow we will have a brainstorming session at the same time. If you'd like to join us and you haven't gotten the connection information, please email me. I'll put my email up on the final slide, and maybe Nick can just share it to everyone. But the final question is, what is your CES superpower? What can you contribute to our brainstorming session, or how can you help others in this space who are wanting to make the next step? And no pressure, Sabrina, but I'm going to pass it to you because I feel like this might have been your idea question to begin with.
Superpower. Yeah, I can pretend I have a superpower. I have a lot of experience now working with artists in celebrations and training and education events, and many of you all do too. But I could help with bringing that language of art and approach into your work. And it's maybe not a superpower yet, but I am working on multi-fluency and making events that are really safe spaces where different knowledge systems are honored. So I think that maybe that's a core value and not a superpower yet.
definitely related. Superpowers and core values. Yeah. All right. Shimmy, can you go next?
Can I have, well, I don't know if it's a superpower, but in Hawaii, and I think in most places, food is superpower in itself. I think, even if it's like a work meeting, just bring something and everyone will be much happier in bringing together. And then, if you can bring something that has some story to it, whether you harvested it yourself or somebody gave you bananas and you made banana bread or something, I think, that's a thing. But sorry, if I can have another one, I think that a really, really useful something is like have a really small icebreaker. We always try to start our events with some kind of cool question with like, hi, I'm so-and-so. And then we ask like, what is your favorite estuarine animal or something, like that just gets everyone more familiar and remembers people too.
Thanks. Casey, I might pass it to you because you're in the same space. You got almost the same background, but from this slightly different angle. Yeah.
Yes, Shimi actually took mine. I was going to say food, but I think also kind of tying into, I guess, the first question. I think that because CES are so natural and organic, I can kind of help with thinking of ways to make the monitoring not imposing and to make it very kind of, I guess, an easy way to kind of do that monitoring without it being so noticeable and being so kind of, I don't want to say imposing, but like informal and I guess making it sure it's like a safe, comfortable space for that to happen.
I'm going to jump in after Casey because I think it's a good segue. So if you do have kind of your thought for your survey or interview or maybe participant observation, I really like thinking through methods and actually like the protocols and kind of approaches and questions that you might ask or some of the details of the actual implementation. And I'm going to pass it to Chris.
Yes, I would say superpower of framing and framing what people are talking about in a way that's positive or a way that lifts up the framing, like coming up from being down in the weeds and framing something higher or more long-term so that people can have more hope.
And then let's pass it to Kristen. Megan, do you want to reverse?
I love this question.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear what Megan's superpower is from her perspective, but I will say from my perspective, Megan's superpower is creating extraordinary charcuterie plates. She basically came in clutch and helped us out with a catering crisis. So she's an amazing artist as it relates to food display. But I think my superpower might be the ability to know when to let go of a process agenda, which is really hard as coastal training program coordinators. But I will say there have been a couple crucial moments during the MDLA where something different was needed, and we needed to be able to kind of adapt, well, see it, identify it, and adapt. And one of those moments was bringing the group together in what we call the leadership circle. And Chris, what you said earlier about like changing the energy, it did something fundamental for the group that it's hard to measure, but I'm thinking about ways to do it. Even just the way that the WhatsApp conversation has changed as a result in how the group is communicating with each other. Again, back to that vulnerability, but it's shifted something in the group. And I think if we weren't able to kind of let go of the process that we had so carefully curated and was there for a really good reason, we wouldn't have been able to kind of see the change in the group. And I mean, the folks coming in really exhausted, really tired, are now in conversation on bus rides back home about like what they're going to do together after the MDLA, having not known each other before. So I think that speaks maybe somewhat to the ability to just shift and be part of the dynamic. But Megan, I'd like to hear her. I'd like to hear what your superpower is from your perspective. You have many.
Well, beyond food, which I think is just very, yeah, very, very important overall. It's mentioned a few times now. Um, I'm also a daughter of a chef, so everything was about food growing up. And besides that, I think specifically what I'm learning from MDLA and then also from my previous experiences in very diverse settings is just really the importance of inclusivity and just understanding people are coming from so many different places and backgrounds. You can still have like a shared thing you love, like an estuary or an animal or food or whatever it is, but you can still come from different backgrounds, and being able to play with that and make sure the inclusivity is there. We really had to take care of that in terms of being bilingual, in terms of putting intercultural competency training within our program, because we knew that if you want to make solutions, you have to understand each other. So I think that's something that's really important that thankfully recently DEI things are coming more not just a checkbox, but actually intentionally ingrained. So that's something that has been really nice to see.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all those superpowers. And I look forward to the seeing those superpowers in action tomorrow during our brainstorming session. But before we go, I do want to ask a couple more mentee questions, and these mentee questions are really going to help us help drive tomorrow's conversation in our brainstorming session. And even if you're not joining us, we'd love to hear from you because I think it's always super relevant and important to know what people are thinking across the entire reserve. So thank you, Nick, for sharing the mentee link. It's also on the top of the slide, which I'm sharing now. And so what do you celebrate in your reserve? Now that we've given you some examples to help jog your memory across the reserve system, what are things that you celebrate? Are there specific species, as Sabrina shared, or events, or times of the year, or food, perhaps? Yeah, what do you celebrate in your reserve? I see friendship, protected beauty, modest tranquility. Any specific species, perhaps, or yeah. Birds, yay. Seasonal changes, awesome, thanks. Recreation, migration, whale, birds, beauty, protection. And so I hope as we went through our sharing our examples today, and you thinking of celebrations in your reserves, perhaps you've thought of maybe some ways to understand some of the cultural ecosystem services that people are celebrating as part of these events. Okay, I'm going to move to our next question, 2 of 3. So in these celebrations, what outcomes are you hoping for when you participate in or host these events? So I think we heard a couple of examples today from our panelists on the intent or the reason why these celebrations are held. And so what about in your reserves? What are the intended outcomes for of these celebrations? So I think today we heard some examples of increasing connections, building, maintaining relationships, more buy-in, connection with community members. Yeah, excellent. In our examples too, I think donations, good point, right? And how, yeah, let's be realistic, right? Another one I heard strongly across several of the examples presented were really understanding the diverse values. So we do have intersectional communities, and they don't have homogenous values amongst them. So understanding the different values that are present even within a single community in or close to our reserve, the awareness of the reserve, providing opportunities for community to connect in ways that work for them, celebrating big wins, awesome, small wins or incremental progress, spreading conservation beyond our boundaries. Awesome. And then our final question, oh, that is our final question. So thank you for sharing those with us today. And I hope if this is something that is of interest to you all, if you see that you could benefit from some thinking together, I hope you do join us tomorrow at our brainstorming session. So same time, we have so many different time zones, and I'm just going to say 9 a.m. Hawaii time, and you can figure it out for your time zone. If you do need a link for the connection for Zoom for tomorrow's session, please email me or probably anyone on this call, really. And then I do want to let you know that part 2 of this 2-part webinar is going to be focused on volunteer activities. So we heard some foreshadowing a little bit from Chris and Shimi and Sabrina, I think, today. But we'll be talking about how, again, this came up in my conversations with folks who are wanting to engage more with CES, but how volunteer activities could be opportunities to engage with CES. Yeah, and then that's it for us today. We thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please get in contact. And I think many of us can stay on for about another 5 minutes or so if you have any more pressing questions for any of us in particular. So thank you very much. We hope to see you tomorrow and or at our next webinar. Thank you.